Welcome to Golden Blue, everybody, home of the college football fan. And don't forget about the checklist. Hat check, sunglasses check, Pepsi check, notes check, sources check, and thick skin is a check. And don't forget to send gear to represent your team and yourself in my background. Send it to P.O. Box 360, Liberty, South Carolina, 29657, and get yourself a shout out. On to the next video. In case you're wondering, these are the teams that we don't have represented for the mini helmets. As you can see, we actually have quite a few big brands that's not represented here at Golden Blue. So get your team represented here on Golden Blue. And you already know what time it is, so might as well sit down, brace yourself, and buckle up because you are entering the speculation zone. We all know that the Pac-12 is in a very, very bad position. We've learned that ESPN is not just lowballing the Pac-12, but they are lowballing the Pac-12. What I'm hearing is they're offering $90 million a year, which would be $9 million per team per year, but for only 10 teams. On top of that, ESPN wants one game a week on cable, linear cable, that would be the Pac-12 After Dark, and then the other game would be on ESPN+. So we've been talking about streaming only or substantially streaming, in other words, like 95% streaming. This is what I'm talking about. One game a week on linear cable, not much exposure at all. My question is this: does this keep the Pac-12 from expanding? We've heard that the Pac-12 wants SMU and San Diego State for sure. They've also talked to Colorado State and a mystery fourth team. I've never found out who that mystery fourth team is. It could be Fresno State, could be Tulane, could be Rice, could be anybody. So we've heard that they want possibly 4 teams, definitely San Diego State and SMU, but they've also talked to Colorado State and a mystery fourth team. Well, with ESPN lowballing them, they might not be able to expand. By the way, this will be a Get It Gang video idea. If you don't know what the Get It Gang is, it's basically a name that I came up with for the group of people that leave video ideas in the comment section of my videos. So if you think you have a good video idea, leave it in the comment section of my videos, and I just might use it on my next video. So this one comes from Doyle Murphy. He says, Golden Blue, here's my question. Will it really do any good at this point for other teams like San Diego State, SMU, Fresno State, Boise State, and Tulane to even join the Pac-12? They got a better chance of being on TV staying put. Mountain West and American may make more than Pac-12. I disagree with that last statement, but let's keep going. I live in Oklahoma, and if Tulsa expressed interest in joining the Pac-12, everyone would be asking why. I don't think that would ever happen, but I understand what you're saying. We will be able to find Tulsa Golden Hurricanes on cable TV better than people will find the Pac-12 daylight or dark. I see what you did there, referencing the Pac-12 After Dark. The Tulsa Golden Hurricanes will have more games broadcasted on cable TV than any team from the Pac-12. That will be mind-blowing. That's a possibility. I don't think that actually happens. I do think that the Pac-12 teams, especially the bigger brands, might get more exposure if they can get that time slot more weeks than not. I'm not sure what the television agreement with the AAC looks like, but as far as specifically Tulsa versus the rest of Pac-12, I don't think that equation equals out. But I understand what you're talking about. The fact that the Pac-12 is only going to be guaranteed one game a week on linear cable, that's not good exposure at all. That's going to affect your NIL revenue. That's affect your recruiting. That's going to affect who you can hire for your coaching staff. So it's going to put the Pac-12 behind the 8 ball. And on top of that, what if enough teams leave and the Pac-12 keeps backfilling and the NCAA looks at the Pac-12 and they're like, okay, now they're under those 6 members that were originally part of the previous agreement when they were still a Power 5 conference. They could take off the protection of the Autonomous 5 or the Power 5 and boom, then the Pac-12 isn't even guaranteed a spot in the playoffs, even with the expansion. Because remember, the top 6 conferences are guaranteed a spot in the new playoffs. So everybody's thinking, okay, the Power 5 conference champions, they're guaranteed a spot. Well, if the Pac-12 is no longer a Power 5 conference, they wouldn't be guaranteed a spot anymore. They could still get in, of course, but the guarantee would be gone. So yes, I truly do think that this situation could keep the Pac-12 from expanding because ESPN is only offering $9 million per team at 10 members. At 10 members. This is not counting if you add these other teams. If you add these other teams, you're going to have to cut that pie more because ESPN is not adding to the pie. They have been clear about that. The Monty Show says he has ESPN sources that are saying they do have this deal on the table. They're not changing it even if the Pac-12 adds more teams. This is the deal, and it's not a good deal at all. So even if there was a lot of switching around, it looks like the Pac-12 could lose Arizona and Colorado to the Big 12. I think that does happen. And then after that, they could lose either Stanford and Cal or Stanford and Washington. And yes, Washington and Oregon would still be on the table, but I have them as the third likely scenario. I think Stanford and Cal would be 1, and Stanford and Washington would be 2. That's the second phase to the Big Ten. And then the next phase could be Washington State and Oregon State, or Utah and Arizona State, or all 4 of them head on over to the Big 12. Those are some big losses. That's a substantial loss. I mentioned basically every team. I don't think every team gets picked off, but a large majority could between the Big 12 and the Big 10. And the teams they could get to replace these teams, San Diego State, SMU, Colorado State, Tulane, Fresno State, even UNLV. Remember, the Pac-12 already plays its Pac-12 championship game in Las Vegas. Now, UNLV doesn't have a great fan base, but they do have good facilities because they share that stadium with the Los Angeles Raiders. So they do have some value to the Pac-12, but compared to these teams that the Pac-12 could lose, not good at all. And let's say the Pac-12 doesn't lose these teams. Well, with this terrible TV deal, they're actually encouraged not to expand because they're just having to split the pie even more. They're not adding any brands that would add to the pie. Now, if the Pac-12 were to somehow convince some teams out of the Big 12 to go over to the Pac-12, that's when the pie could increase. Could increase, still not guaranteed. Numbskull News says this: no ESPN, no deal, no grant of rights. Without ESPN, there will be no Pac-12. I haven't thought of that. Is that for real? If ESPN backs out of this deal altogether, right now they're wanting to be a very, very small part of this deal, very much lowballing the Pac-12. But if they backed off altogether, would there be no grant of rights in the Pac-12? I don't know how that works out. Because if that is true, if Numbskull News, which by the way, I love that name, that's funny. If ESPN backs out of that, does the Pac-12 really not have a grant of rights? And if that's the case, even if they sign this TV deal, these teams could still bolt at any time. Even if it's a 10-year TV deal, there still might be a buyout, a penalty for that. But as far as getting out of the grant of rights, well, there wouldn't be any grant of rights. So they wouldn't have to pay a hefty fine. And I'm still hearing that Oregon and Washington, they're still not willing to sign a grant of rights past 3 years. Because they want to make sure if and when the Big Ten does come a calling, they don't have to pay a hefty fine to get out. The Big Ten wants the same thing if the Big Ten is interested in Washington and Oregon. I think they're more likely to be interested in Stanford and Cal. Stanford and Cal doesn't bring as much athletics as Washington and Oregon, but they are elite with their academics, their research revenue, their grants, their endowments, and the Big Ten would definitely be interested in that. Because remember, the Big Ten is a Commonwealth conference. Everybody shares their resources with everybody. And just to be affiliated with Stanford and Cal, that increases your research revenue right off the top. That's the main reason why Utah said, we're never going to the Big 12. That would hurt our research revenue substantially. So if you take out Stanford and Cal, then all these excuses of being connected to Stanford and Cal is not there. It doesn't exist. So then Utah wouldn't really have an excuse to stay in the Pac-12 because the money would be better in the Big 12. And staying in the Pac-12 doesn't mean you have a connection with Stanford and Cal anymore because they would be gone to the Big Ten. I've talked about that multiple times. That would be the kill shot for the Big Ten if they actually went after Stanford and Cal. Or even Washington and Cal. That could be a kill shot as well. But Washington, Oregon, I still think the Pac-12 could still survive after that. They would make less money, but these other brands, these other universities, they do like that affiliation with Stanford and Cal. So that's something to think about. If ESPN does back out of this, does the Pac-12 not have a grant of rights at all? And then they have to be on high alert all the time, all the time. These teams can leave at any moment because they don't have to pay to get out of the grant of rights. That is something serious to think about right now. So the bottom line is ESPN is lowballing the Pac-12. They're wanting to be a small part of the Pac-12, $9 million per team per year at 10 teams. Expansion would hurt that number. But if ESPN backs out, then maybe there's no grant of rights and these teams could jump without a hefty fine. Not a good situation at all for the Pac-12. Now, there's a real possibility that the Pac-12 could survive this. Yes, absolutely. But right now, it's seeming less and less likely. All the people that I talked to that's more on the Pac-12 side, basically the advocates for the Pac-12, they have given me dates multiple times. And every time that date has come and that date has gone and we've heard nothing. And these presidents and these athletic directors are having to come out and show support for George Kliavkoff. And George Kliavkoff is saying nothing. I think that's a sign of a weak leader. Never should have been hired as the Pac-12 commissioner. Bad hire, Pac-12. But hey, you learn from your mistakes. And even if the Pac-12 does get through this, they need to have a real serious talk with George Kliavkoff and be like, we can't do this again. This was a stressful situation and you made the Pac-12 look bad. You have to be better at making decisions. So even if the Pac-12 makes it through this, there still could be some ramifications for George Kliavkoff in the future. So y'all let me know in the comment section. Number one, do you think if the Pac-12 does accept this TV deal, they're actually not going to expand because ESPN is not budging? Number two, if ESPN decides to back out and they're not going to do this at all, or maybe the Pac-12 denies them and says this is not going to work out, is there a possibility that there might not even be a grant of rights and these teams could leave whenever they want without a hefty penalty? And number three, if the Pac-12 does survive this, does George Kliavkoff keep his job for the long haul? Or do they decide, hey, this is the last straw. We can't go through this again. Sorry, buddy. You got to go. That's all I got for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you on my next show.